A struggling artist took in a stray dog, never realizing it would lead her to a lost Van Gogh painting. This thought would have seemed absurd to Claire Winters 6 months ago, when she'd been too consumed with her own failures to believe in serendipity, let alone miracles. The January wind sliced through her thin coat as she trudged home from another rejection. Gallery number 7, or was it 8? She'd lost count. The portfolio clutched against her chest felt heavier with each step, the canvas samples inside representing 3 years of work that nobody wanted. 3 years of pouring her soul onto canvases that collected dust in her cramped studio apartment. 3 years of instant ramen and past due notices. Claire's fingers had gone numb by the time she reached her building, a dilapidated brownstone in a forgotten corner of the city. The elevator was broken again. Of course it was. She climbed 5 flights of stairs, each step a reminder of how far she'd fallen from the promising art school graduate she'd once been. 29 years old and nothing to show for it but calloused fingers and an empty bank account. When she reached her door, something made her pause. A soft whimpering sound drifted from the stairwell below. Claire closed her eyes, willing herself to ignore it. She couldn't afford another distraction, another responsibility. She inserted her key into the lock. The whimper came again, louder this time, followed by a pathetic scratching sound. "Go away," she whispered, not sure if she was talking to the sound or to the unwelcome compassion stirring in her chest. But her traitorous feet were already turning, already carrying her back down the stairs. There, huddled against the radiator on the landing, was a bundle of matted fur and protruding ribs. A dog, some kind of terrier mix, trembling violently, one paw held at an awkward angle. "Hey there," Claire said, her voice rusty from disuse. When was the last time she'd spoken aloud to anyone? Days, maybe? The dog's eyes, large and luminous in the dim stairwell, lifted to meet hers. Something inside Claire shifted, like the first crack in winter ice. "I can't help you," she told the dog firmly. "I can barely help myself." The dog didn't move, just continued that steady, plaintive gaze that seemed to see straight through her carefully constructed walls. Outside, snow began to fall in thick, heavy flakes. The building's ancient heating system groaned and rattled, struggling against the cold. Claire thought of her empty apartment, the silence, the solitude, the paintings that nobody wanted to see. "One night," she said finally, setting down her portfolio. "That's it, just until the storm passes." The dog's tail thumped weakly against the floor. Claire hesitated, then shed her scarf, a luxury she couldn't really afford but had bought during more optimistic times, and wrapped it gently around the trembling animal. When she lifted him, she was shocked at how light he was, how easily his body fit against hers, as if the space had been waiting for him. "Don't get comfortable," she murmured as she carried him up the stairs. "This isn't permanent." But even as she spoke the words, something whispered in the back of her mind that she was already lying, to the dog, to herself, to the universe that had somehow placed this creature in her path on the coldest day of the year. Claire's apartment was small, a studio with paint-splattered floors and north-facing windows that never quite let in enough light. Canvases lined the walls, stacked 3 and 4 deep in some places. Half-finished works cluttered every surface, each one an abandoned attempt to capture something that kept eluding her. Authenticity, emotion, that ineffable quality that made art transcend technique. She cleared a space on the threadbare couch and laid the dog down gently. He was in rough shape, ribs visible through his dirty coat, one paw definitely injured, ears tattered from fights or frost or both. But those eyes, they watched her with a calm awareness that was almost unnerving. "I don't have dog food," Claire told him, rummaging through her nearly empty refrigerator. "I barely have people food." She found some leftover chicken from the meal she'd stretched across 3 days and filled a chipped bowl with water. The dog ate cautiously at first, then with growing enthusiasm, while Claire sat cross-legged on the floor watching him. "You need a name," she said after a while. "Just for tonight." The dog looked up, licking his muzzle. Claire's eyes drifted to the small print hanging above her desk, a reproduction of Van Gogh's Starry Night that she'd bought as a student. It was the only decoration in the apartment that wasn't her own work, a reminder of the artist who had shaped her earliest dreams. "Vincent," she decided. "I'll call you Vincent." The dog, Vincent, tilted his head as if considering the name, then laid it down on his paws with a small sigh that seemed to say, "That will do." Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the city in silence. For the first time in months, Claire didn't feel completely alone. She slept on the floor that night, unwilling to move Vincent from his comfortable spot on the couch. When she woke, stiff and cold, the first pale light of dawn was filtering through the windows, and Vincent was watching her, his head resting on the edge of the couch, eyes patient and knowing. "Still here, huh?" Claire sat up, rubbing her neck. "I guess we both survived the night." Vincent's tail thumped against the cushions. Claire's phone buzzed, a reminder of her shift at the coffee shop, the job that kept her from complete destitution. She stood, wincing at the stiffness in her back. "I have to go to work," she told Vincent, feeling strangely compelled to explain herself. "You ... Stay here, I guess. Don't destroy anything." Vincent blinked slowly, his expression almost offended at the suggestion. Claire hesitated at the door. "This is still temporary," she said firmly. "I'll figure something out when I get back." But as she navigated the icy sidewalks to the coffee shop, Vincent's face kept appearing in her mind, those eyes that somehow made her feel both seen and accepted, something she hadn't experienced in longer than she cared to admit. The coffee shop was busy, tourists seeking refuge from the cold. Claire moved mechanically through her shift, making lattes and wiping tables with practiced efficiency, while her mind drifted back to her apartment, to the unexpected guest awaiting her return. "You seem different today," Marcus, her manager, commented during a rare lull. "Less, gloomy?" Claire shrugged, uncomfortable with the observation. "Just tired," she lied. But on her walk home, she stopped at a corner store and spent $15 precious on dog food, a cheap leash, and a second-hand bowl. "Just until I find him a proper home," she told herself. "Just until his paw heals." Vincent greeted her at the door with unmistakable joy, hopping awkwardly on 3 legs, his entire body wiggling with delight. Something warm bloomed in Claire's chest, a feeling so unfamiliar that it took her a moment to recognize it as happiness. "It's just temporary," she reminded him as she poured kibble into the new bowl. But the words sounded hollow, even to her own ears. Days passed, then weeks. Vincent's paw slowly healed. Claire fashioned a makeshift splint from materials in her art supplies, and gradually he began putting weight on it. His coat, with regular brushing, revealed itself to be not the dull brown she'd first thought, but a rich golden color dappled with patches of white and gray. Claire found herself talking to him constantly, about her failed gallery submissions, about the customers at the coffee shop, about the paintings that refused to come alive under her brush. Vincent listened with the attentive focus of someone who understood every word, his head tilted, ears perked forward. At night, he slept curled against her side, a warm, steady presence that somehow kept the worst of her nightmares at bay. And in the mornings, he watched her paint, his steady gaze somehow less judgmental than her own internal critic. Without quite meaning to, Claire began to paint more regularly again. Small pieces at first, studies of Vincent sleeping, the way the light caught his fur, the alert intelligence in his eyes. Then larger works, infused with something she couldn't quite name but that felt dangerously like hope. "What do you think?" she asked him one evening, stepping back from a canvas she'd been working on for days. It showed a solitary figure walking through snow, but unlike her previous work, which had emphasized the isolation, this painting included a warm light spilling from a distant window, illuminating the path ahead. Vincent barked once, his tail sweeping the floor. Claire laughed, a sound so rusty from disuse that it startled her. "I'll take that as approval." February melted into March. Claire's routine shifted to accommodate Vincent's needs. Morning walks before work, longer explorations of the neighborhood on her days off. She discovered parks she'd never noticed, spoke to neighbors whose faces became familiar, felt the dormant muscles of her smile awakening after long hibernation. "You're keeping me, aren't you?" she asked Vincent one evening as they shared the couch, her sketchbook balanced on her knees, his head resting on her thigh. "So much for temporary." Vincent sighed contentedly, eyes closing as her fingers found the spot behind his ears that made his leg twitch with pleasure. It was during one of their weekend walks that everything changed. They had ventured further than usual, to an older part of the city with narrow streets and antique shops. Vincent trotted happily beside her, his limp now barely noticeable, occasionally stopping to investigate an interesting scent. Outside a small, dusty shop with a faded sign reading Harrison's Antiquities, Vincent suddenly froze. His ears pricked forward, his body tensing like a pointer indicating prey. "What is it, boy?" Claire asked, following his gaze to the cluttered window display. Vincent barked sharply, tugging at the leash with uncharacteristic insistence. Okay, Claire laughed, allowing herself to be pulled toward the shop. I get it. You've developed a taste for antiques. A bell jangled discordantly as they entered. The shop was crammed with furniture, porcelain figurines, tarnished silver, and framed artwork of varying quality. The air smelled of dust and old paper, with an undertone of something Claire recognized from her art restoration classes: linseed oil and aged varnish. Vincent moved with purpose, weaving through the cluttered aisles, nose to the ground, Claire following, bemused in his wake. At the back of the shop, he stopped before a stack of framed paintings leaning against the wall, most covered in a film of dust. "Find something interesting?" A voice startled Claire. She turned to see an elderly man with wire-rimmed glasses perched on a stool behind a glass counter. "I'm not sure," Claire admitted, glancing down at Vincent, who was now pawing determinedly at one particular frame. "My dog seems to think so." The man chuckled. "Smart dog. Those came in last week from an estate sale. Haven't had time to sort through them properly." Vincent whined, his paw scratching more insistently. "May I?" Claire asked, gesturing to the stack. The shopkeeper nodded. "Be my guest. Though I doubt there's anything valuable there. Mostly amateur landscapes from what I saw." Claire carefully moved the frames, setting them one by one against a nearby cabinet. Vincent's excitement grew with each painting she removed, until finally she lifted out a medium-sized canvas in a badly damaged gilded frame. The moment she saw it, her breath caught. It was a small landscape, perhaps 12 by 16 inches, showing a field of wheat under a turbulent sky. The brushwork was bold, almost violent in places, the paint applied in thick, passionate strokes that created a sense of movement, as if the wheat itself was alive, breathing under the artist's hand. And the colors, blues and golds that vibrated against each other, creating an almost painful beauty. Vincent sat back on his haunches, his mission apparently accomplished, tail sweeping a semicircle in the dust. Claire's hands trembled as she carefully turned the painting to examine the back. The canvas was old, the stretcher weathered and cracked in places. There was no signature visible on the front, but on the back, barely legible in the dim light, was a faded inscription. "Do you have a magnifying glass?" Claire asked, her voice strangely distant to her own ears. The shopkeeper rummaged beneath the counter and produced an antique brass magnifier. Claire held it over the inscription, heart pounding so loudly she was certain it must be audible throughout the shop. There, in faded ink, were the initials VVG, followed by a date, 1889. The room seemed to tilt slightly. Claire steadied herself against the counter. "How much for this one?" she asked, striving for casualness. The shopkeeper glanced at it dismissively. $100 for the frame? It's in rough shape, but it's genuine gilt." Claire nodded, trying to control her breathing. "I'll take it." Vincent watched the transaction with apparent satisfaction, sitting patiently while Claire counted out nearly all the cash in her wallet, money she had been saving for art supplies, for next month's electricity bill. Outside, her hands still shaking, Claire knelt beside Vincent. "What did you just do?" she whispered, half laughing, half crying. "Do you have any idea what this might be?" Vincent licked her cheek, his eyes bright with what looked remarkably like pride. Back in her apartment, Claire placed the painting carefully on her easel and examined it under the strong light she used for her own work. The more she looked, the more certain she became. The brushwork, the color palette, the emotional intensity radiating from the canvas, all bore the unmistakable hallmarks of Vincent van Gogh. But how? How could an unknown Van Gogh be sitting in a dusty antique shop 3 blocks from her apartment? And how had Vincent, a stray dog she'd impulsively rescued, led her directly to it? Claire spent the night researching, her laptop balanced on her knees, Vincent curled beside her on the couch. She found references to several lost Van Gogh works, paintings mentioned in the artist's letters to his brother Theo, but never catalogued, presumed destroyed or lost to time. One in particular caught her attention, a small landscape Vincent had described painting during a rare period of optimism at the asylum in Saint-Remy. "I have painted the wheat field with a rising sun," he wrote to Theo. "The sky is yellow and green, the field itself a blonde yellow with some orange and blue touches. I believe there is some hope in this one." Claire's eyes moved from the screen to the painting on her easel. Yellow sky, golden wheat, touches of blue and orange. The description matched perfectly. She thought of her art history professors, the contacts she'd lost touch with after graduation. There was Dr. Emerson at the university, an expert in post-impressionism, and Marion Hayes at the City Museum, who specialized in authentication of 19th century works. But doubt crept in, cold and familiar. Who was she to make such a claim? A failed artist working in a coffee shop, living in a studio apartment with a rescued dog. They would laugh her out of their offices. Vincent nudged her hand with his nose, as if sensing her spiraling thoughts. "You're right," Claire sighed, scratching behind his ears. "One step at a time. First, we need to document everything properly." She spent the next day photographing the painting from every angle, documenting the cracked varnish, the age of the canvas, the distinctive brushwork. She made detailed notes about the provenance, what little she knew from the antique shop owner, and compared the work to known Van Goghs from the same period. The more she examined it, the more convinced she became. This wasn't just a skillful imitation. This was the real thing. A lost piece of art history, a painting that captured a moment of hope in the troubled life of an artist who had shaped her own path so profoundly. After 3 days of research and documentation, Claire finally worked up the courage to email Dr. Emerson, attaching several high-resolution photographs and a detailed analysis of the painting's characteristics. She kept her tone professional, matter-of-fact, though her finger hovered over the send button for nearly 10 minutes before she finally pressed it. The reply came faster than she expected, arriving the very next morning. "Ms. Winters, this is indeed intriguing. While I cannot offer any definitive judgment based on photographs alone, what you've shown me warrants further investigation. I would like to examine the painting in person. Would tomorrow at 2 p.m. be convenient? My office at the university. Regards, Dr. Thomas Emerson." Claire read the email 3 times, Vincent watching her with his head tilted questioningly. "He wants to see it," she told him, voice barely above a whisper. "He actually wants to see it." Vincent's tail thumped against the couch cushions. The meeting with Dr. Emerson was both terrifying and exhilarating. Claire wrapped the painting carefully in acid-free paper and carried it to the university in a portfolio case, Vincent trotting faithfully at her side. She'd debated leaving him at home, but ultimately couldn't bear to separate herself from the very creature who had led her to this moment. "Doctor." Emerson raised his eyebrows at the dog, but made no comment as he ushered them into his office, a book-lined room with large windows overlooking the campus quad. With reverent hands, he unwrapped the painting and placed it on a special stand, adjusting the lights to illuminate it properly. For long minutes he said nothing, just studied the canvas through a magnifying glass, occasionally making notes on a legal pad. Claire held her breath, acutely aware of Vincent sitting perfectly still beside her chair, as if he too understood the gravity of the moment. Finally, Dr. Emerson looked up, his expression unreadable behind his glasses. "You understand?" he said carefully. "That definitive authentication will require technical analysis, pigment testing, radiography, infrared reflectography. That's beyond my capabilities here." Claire nodded, heart sinking. "Of course, I understand. However," he continued, a note of excitement creeping into his scholarly voice, "based on my examination of the brushwork, the palette, the canvas age, and the inscription, I believe you may indeed have found something remarkable." The room seemed to sway slightly. Claire gripped the arms of her chair. "You think it's genuine?" "I think it warrants a full authentication process at a major institution." He removed his glasses, polishing them with a handkerchief. "I've taken the liberty of contacting a colleague at the Metropolitan Museum. She's an expert in Van Gogh and has access to the necessary technical equipment. She's willing to examine the painting next week." Claire's mind raced. The Metropolitan Museum. Authentication. This was really happening. "There's something else you should know, Doctor," Emerson added, replacing his glasses. "If this painting is authenticated as a genuine Van Gogh, particularly one from the Saint-Remy period that matches a written description, we're potentially talking about a work valued in the tens of millions." The words hung in the air between them. Tens of millions. The amount was so vast it seemed almost abstract, impossible to connect to her life of past due notices and carefully rationed groceries. Vincent leaned against her leg, a warm, solid presence anchoring her to reality. "What happens now?" Claire asked, her voice steadier than she expected. The next week passed in a blur. Claire took unpaid leave from the coffee shop, ignoring Marcus's concerned questions. She barely slept, alternating between frantic research and periods of stunned disbelief. Through it all, Vincent remained her constant companion, sleeping curled against her when she finally collapsed from exhaustion, waiting patiently during the endless phone calls and email exchanges with museum officials and authentication experts. The examination at the Metropolitan Museum was exhaustive. Claire watched as white-gloved technicians photographed, scanned, and analyzed every millimeter of the painting. They took minute samples of paint from the edges, examined the canvas weave under powerful microscopes, performed chemical analyses of the pigments. Through it all, Vincent sat quietly in a corner of the lab, granted special permission after Claire explained his role in the discovery. The museum staff initially looked skeptical, but something about Vincent's dignified demeanor, the way he observed the proceedings with apparent understanding, soon won them over. "He acts like he painted it himself," one technician joked, offering Vincent a treat. 3 days later, Claire sat in the office of Dr. Eleanor Klein, the Metropolitan's senior curator of European paintings, Vincent at her feet. The painting sat on a stand between them, looking simultaneously humble and magnificent under the carefully calibrated museum lighting. "The results are conclusive, Dr. Klein said, her voice containing the measured excitement of someone who had spent a lifetime studying great art. "Pigment analysis matches known Van Gogh works from 1889. Canvas and stretcher are period appropriate. Radiography reveals no underlying images or modern materials. The brushwork is unmistakable." She paused, allowing the moment its due weight. "This is, without question, a previously unknown work by Vincent van Gogh, likely the Wheatfield painting he described to Theo in his letter of June 1889. Claire pressed a hand to her mouth, tears welling in her eyes. Vincent leaned against her legs, his warm presence the only thing keeping her grounded. "There will need to be official announcements, of course," Dr. Klein continued. "The discovery of a lost Van Gogh is major news in the art world. And we need to discuss what you intend to do with the painting, what she intended to do with it." The question hadn't fully formed in Claire's mind until this moment. Sell it? The money would transform her life completely. Keep it? Impossible. The security alone would cost more than her annual income. Donate it? But to whom? "I need time to think," Claire managed. "Doctor." Klein nodded, understanding. "Of course. Though I should warn you, once news of this discovery breaks, your life will change considerably. Authenticity brings attention, Miss Winters. Are you prepared for that?" Claire wasn't prepared. How could she be? Nothing in her life had prepared her for any of this. Not for the stray dog who had somehow led her to a priceless masterpiece. Not for the sudden shift from obscurity to the center of the art world's attention. The story broke 2 days later, after the Metropolitan Museum issued a carefully worded press release announcing the authentication of a previously unknown Van Gogh landscape. The release mentioned Claire by name as the discoverer, along with her dog Vincent, who first alerted her to the painting's presence. By that evening, Claire's phone was ringing constantly with calls from reporters, gallery owners, and art collectors. Her email inbox filled faster than she could read the messages. Someone from a morning talk show left 3 voicemails. Overwhelmed, Claire took Vincent and fled to a small hotel on the outskirts of the city, using some of the advance she'd been offered by the museum for temporary custodianship of the painting while she decided its fate. In the anonymous quiet of the hotel room, with Vincent curled beside her on the bed, Claire finally had space to think. The painting was currently valued at approximately $40 million. The amount was so vast it seemed unreal, disconnected from anything in her experience. "What would you do?" she asked Vincent, who gazed back at her with his usual attentive expression. "It's your discovery too, after all." Vincent tilted his head, ears perked forward. Claire thought about Van Gogh himself, the artist who had never sold a painting in his lifetime, who had created beauty through unimaginable personal suffering, whose work now commanded prices that would have seemed like fiction to him. She thought about her own abandoned dreams, the paintings stacked in her apartment that no one had wanted to see, the slow death of her creative spirit under the weight of rejection and financial struggle. And she thought about Vincent, not her dog but the artist, writing to his brother about the Wheatfield painting, saying, "I believe there is some hope in this one." Hope. That was what Vincent, her Vincent, had brought back into her life. Not just through the painting, but through his steady presence, his uncomplicated love, his ability to see value in what others overlooked. 3 days later, Claire called Dr. Klein with her decision. The announcement came 2 weeks afterward. The newly discovered Van Gogh, titled Wheat Field with Rising Sun, Hope, would be donated to the Metropolitan Museum with two conditions: that it be permanently displayed in the main gallery rather than stored in archives, and that a special educational program be established in Van Gogh's name to support struggling artists. The museum, recognizing the publicity value of the story, agreed readily to both conditions and added a third, a substantial financial award to Claire as the donor, amounting to $5 million, a fraction of the painting's market value, but a sum that would transform her life completely. The press went wild for the story: the struggling artist, the rescued stray dog, the miraculous discovery, the generous donation. Claire found herself giving interviews, appearing on television, telling and retelling the tale of how Vincent had led her to the painting, how a simple act of kindness on a cold January night had changed everything. Through it all, Vincent remained by her side, unperturbed by cameras and microphones, accepting the attention with the same calm dignity with which he'd entered her life. 6 months after that snowy night when she'd first carried Vincent up 5 flights of stairs, Claire stood in her new studio, a sun-filled loft with high ceilings and large windows. Her paintings lined the walls, no longer stacked and forgotten, but properly displayed, some marked with small red dots indicating sales. The story of the Van Gogh discovery had created interest in her own work, and for the first time galleries were calling her. Her paintings, now infused with a new emotional depth, a vibrancy that had been missing before, were beginning to sell. Not for millions, but enough that she no longer needed to count pennies for groceries or worry about the electricity bill. Vincent lay in a patch of sunlight on the polished wooden floor, watching as Claire worked on her latest canvas, a large, luminous painting showing a small dog leading a woman through a field of golden wheat toward a distant light. "What do you think?" Claire asked, stepping back to assess the work. "Is it finished?" Vincent considered the painting, then rose and padded over to her, pressing against her legs in what she had come to recognize as approval. Claire smiled, setting down her brush to kneel beside him. "You knew all along, didn't you? That's why you came to me that night." Vincent's eyes, wise and gentle, met hers. In them, Claire saw the same thing she now tried to capture in every painting, that ineffable quality that transforms craft into art, solitude into connection, suffering into growth. Hope. Outside, the late summer light turned the city golden, washing over rooftops and through windows, illuminating ordinary moments with extraordinary beauty. Claire wrapped her arms around Vincent, burying her face in his fur, feeling his steady heartbeat against her chest. A struggling artist had taken in a stray dog, never realizing it would lead her to a lost Van Gogh painting, but more importantly, never realizing it would lead her back to herself, to the joy of creation, to the understanding that the most valuable masterpieces aren't always hanging on gallery walls. Sometimes they're sitting right beside you, tail thumping against the floor, waiting for their next walk in the sun.